By the end of his life, it's likely that you'll find what matters, if you're honest. Marlon Brando spent most of his career refusing to be pinned down by studios, by expectations, by the labels other people tried to put on him. He was not a man who made things simple. In his later years, living quietly on his private island and in his home in Los Angeles, he was known among people close to him for long conversations, the kind that stretched past midnight, that moved from one subject to another without ever quite settling anywhere, that seemed less like conversations and more like a person thinking out loud in the company of someone patient enough to listen. One subject he returned to again and again in those late-night conversations was a question he struggled to name cleanly. Not, "Is there a God?" At least not in the conventional way that question is usually asked. Something more personal than that. Something closer to, what was all of this for? He had lived a remarkable life, by any measure. He had changed how people understood acting. He had been celebrated, attacked, misunderstood, and celebrated again. He had loved people, and lost them, and built things, and watched some of them fall apart. He had been on screen in films that 100 years from now, people will still be watching. And yet, in those quiet hours, he was still sitting with a question that no amount of achievement had ever fully answered. Not with bitterness, not with regret exactly, more with the calm, unhurried curiosity of someone who has finally set down everything else he was carrying and now has time to ask the questions that had always been there underneath. Those who knew him in those years described someone who read voraciously, philosophy, religion, science, poetry, and who seemed genuinely open to being wrong about everything he'd previously believed. He didn't need to arrive at a conclusion. He seemed content, in some ways, with the asking itself, with the company of someone willing to sit alongside the questions without rushing toward an answer. He once said something to a close friend that stayed with that person long after the conversation ended. He said that he thought the most courageous thing a person could do late in life was to stop pretending they had it all figured out, that there was a kind of freedom in admitting that the biggest questions about God or meaning or what happens after had never actually been resolved for him, that he didn't know, and that not knowing, finally out in the open, was strangely peaceful. That was the realization. That faith in any form or in no particular form isn't really about having the answers. It's about being willing to live inside the question, without forcing a conclusion, and without pretending the question isn't there. Maybe you felt that too. Maybe, in the quieter parts of your life, late at night, or in a moment when nothing is demanding your attention, a question like this has come up for you too. Not necessarily about religion, exactly. Maybe something vaguer and harder to name. What was all of this for? Did my life mean something? Is there anything waiting on the other side of all of this? And maybe you've pushed the question aside, the way busy people often do. Because there's always something more immediate to attend to. Because the question is big, and there's no obvious answer, and sitting with a big, unanswerable question can feel uncomfortable, even frightening. Better to stay busy better to keep moving. Here's something gentle to consider. The question doesn't go away just because you stop looking at it. It tends to sit there, quietly, growing a little heavier with every year that passes without being acknowledged. But when you do turn and face it, when you let yourself actually sit with it, without demanding an answer right away, something shifts. Not because the question gets answered. It probably won't. Not in any clean, satisfying way. But because the act of sitting with it, honestly, with some gentleness toward yourself, is its own form of peace. You stop carrying the extra weight of pretending the question isn't there. And that alone can feel like something. Marlon Brando's life was, from the outside, one of extraordinary turbulence. Fame at a young age, controversy throughout, personal losses that would have broken most people, long stretches of deliberate withdrawal from the world. By any conventional measure, it was complicated. But those who were with him in his final years described something unexpected in those late conversations. A person who had, somehow, arrived at a kind of peace that had nothing to do with resolving anything. He hadn't figured out the answers to his biggest questions. He had simply stopped being afraid of living without them. Maybe it's time to do the same. Not to give up on faith, whatever that word means to you personally. Whether it lives inside a tradition or outside one, or somewhere in between. But to make room for the honest version of it. The version that includes, I don't know. The version that can hold a question alongside a belief without one canceling the other out. Maybe it's time to let yourself sit, quietly, with the biggest question you've been carrying, without needing to resolve it tonight, or ever. Just to acknowledge that it's there, that it has always been there, and that the fact that you're still asking it this late in your life is not a sign of failure. It might actually be a sign of honesty. And there's something worth saying about the different ways people carry these questions. Some people carry them through formal faith, a church, a synagogue, a mosque, a practice that gives the question a container and a community. And that can be a profound comfort. If that's how your faith lives, it's worth honoring. But some people carry these questions differently, without a formal tradition, without a community built around the question, sometimes without a word for what they believe or don't believe. And they can feel, in the quieter moments, like they're carrying something private and heavy, with no one to put it alongside. If that's you, maybe it helps to know that one of the most celebrated and complicated minds of the 20th century sat with exactly the same uncertainty and found, in the sitting itself, something like rest. There's a particular kind of courage that only becomes available later in life, when most of the external demands have quieted, when there's finally enough stillness to hear the questions that have been there all along, underneath everything. Not the questions about career or money or what other people think. The deeper ones. The quieter ones. The ones that have been patiently waiting your whole life for a moment of stillness like this. Maybe this is yours. Not necessarily with an answer ready, but with a willingness to stop avoiding the question, to let it exist openly in the daylight or in the quiet before you fall asleep, without shame and without urgency. If you're watching this tonight, and a question like this lives somewhere in you, about meaning or faith or what it all adds up to, maybe tonight is a good night to let it come forward. Not to solve anything, just to acknowledge it. To say quietly to yourself, I have this question, and that's all right. Marlon Brando, one of the most singular human beings who ever walked onto a stage or a screen, spent his final years asking questions he couldn't answer, and finding, in the asking itself, something he had been missing for a very long time. Maybe it's time to give your own questions that same quiet permission. Not to find the answer, just to ask. There's another angle to this, too, worth sitting with for a moment. Sometimes it's not your own faith that feels uncertain. It's someone else's. A spouse who believes differently than you do. A grown child who has walked away from the faith you raised them in. A parent, near the end of their life, asking questions that the religion they practiced for decades can no longer fully quiet. If any of that is familiar, here's something gentle to consider. Faith is one of the most personal things a human being carries. More personal, in some ways, than almost anything else. The way someone else makes peace with the biggest questions of their life may not look anything like the way you have. And that difference doesn't have to become a distance. Maybe, if there's someone in your life whose faith journey looks different from yours, the most valuable thing you can offer isn't persuasion or correction or reassurance that they'll eventually arrive where you are. Maybe it's simply the willingness to sit alongside their questions, the way Brando's friends sat alongside his, without needing to resolve anything. To say, quietly, I don't fully understand where you are with all of this, but I'm not going anywhere. That kind of companionship, in the big, unanswerable moments, is often what people mean when they speak later in life about the people who really mattered to them. Not the ones who had all the answers, not the ones who told them what to believe, or what to do, or where to find peace. The ones who simply stayed, in the uncertainty, with them. Marlon Brando, for all his complexity and all his contradictions, seemed to find this kind of companionship in his final years. People willing to sit for hours alongside questions that had no tidy ending. And by most accounts, those were some of the most peaceful evenings of his life. If you're watching this tonight, whether your faith is certain, uncertain, traditional, untraditional, or simply a quiet and private relationship with something larger than yourself, maybe there's one question you've been carrying alone that deserves a little company. A friend who might sit with you in it. A journal entry that gets it out into the open. Or simply the quiet permission you give yourself, right now, to admit that the question is there, and that not having the answer doesn't mean you're lost. It might just mean you're human. In the most honest, most gentle, most real way there is. So take a slow breath, and maybe tonight, let the question be enough.